In 1913, the United States government convinced its citizens to accept something unthinkable, a tax on their income. Not on their land, not on their purchases, on the money they earned through their own labor. And here's the part they don't teach you in school. When they sold it to the public, they promised it would only affect the rich. They said the rates would stay low. They called it temporary. Over a century later, nearly 2/3 of Americans pay income taxes. The top rate has reached as high as 94%, and the tax code has ballooned from 3 pages to over 1,000. What was sold as a small tax on millionaires became the single greatest extraction machine in human history. And it all started with a political trick that backfired and a population that believed the promises of their government. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history. And remember, simple is never easy. Before 1913, the federal government had no permanent income tax. It funded itself primarily through tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes on specific products like whiskey and tobacco. The Founding Fathers were deeply suspicious of any direct tax on income. They understood that such a power, once granted, would be nearly impossible to constrain. For over a century, they were proven right. America built railroads, schools, roads, and an army, all without reaching into the pockets of its workers. But by the early 1900s, that was about to change. The push for an income tax came from an unlikely alliance: progressives who wanted to tax the wealthy, and populists who resented the tariff system that they believed favored Eastern industrialists over farmers in the South and West. The argument was simple and seductive. The tariff made imported goods expensive for ordinary people, while the rich paid almost nothing. An income tax, they argued, would finally force the robber barons to pay their fair share. It was meant to be a weapon against wealth inequality, a tool to soak the rich. In 1909, conservative Republicans in Congress made a calculated gamble. Hoping to kill the income tax idea for good, they proposed a constitutional amendment. Their logic was cynical but confident. Amendments require ratification by 3/4 of the states, and they believed this would never happen. Surely enough state legislatures would reject such a radical expansion of federal power. They were catastrophically wrong. By February 1913, 42 states, 6 more than needed, had ratified the 16th Amendment. The income tax was now permanently embedded in the Constitution. When the Revenue Act of 1913 took effect, the rates seemed almost laughable, a mere 1% on income above $3,000, roughly $95,000 in today's dollars. The top rate was just 7%, and that only applied to income above $500,000, the equivalent of more than 11 million today. The average American worker earned about $800 a year at the time. Less than 1% of the population paid any income tax at all. The first Form 1040 was 3 pages long with a single page of instructions. This was a tax designed, it seemed, only for millionaires. The public was reassured. Ordinary people would never have to worry about it. But here is the lesson history teaches again and again. Once a government creates a mechanism for extracting wealth, it will expand. And the expansion came faster than anyone imagined. Just 4 years after the tax was introduced, America entered World War I. War is expensive, and governments at war need money fast. By 1916, the top rate had already doubled to 15%. By 1917, it jumped to 67%. By 1918, it reached 77%. In 5 years, the temporary tax that was supposed to affect only millionaires had grown tenfold. And each time, it was justified as a patriotic duty, a wartime necessity, a sacrifice for the greater good. The pattern repeated during World War II. By 1944, the top marginal rate hit 94%, and something even more transformative happened. The tax that once touched less than 1% of Americans now reached nearly 2/3 of the population. In 1940, only 7% of American families paid income tax. By 1944, that number had exploded to 64%. What began as a class tax on the wealthy had become a mass tax on almost everyone. And to make collection more efficient, Congress introduced payroll withholding. The government would take your money before you ever saw it. And here's the trick that made this expansion invisible: bracket creep. Until 1985, tax brackets were not adjusted for inflation. That meant as prices rose and nominal wages increased, workers were pushed into higher tax brackets, even if their real purchasing power stayed the same. Inflation itself became a silent tax increase. The government didn't need to pass new laws to raise your taxes. It just needed to let inflation do the work. For decades, this hidden mechanism drained wealth from workers who never even knew it was happening. But the 1913 income tax wasn't enacted in isolation. That same year, something else was born: the Federal Reserve. December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, creating America's central bank. This was not a coincidence. The income tax gave the government a permanent, uncapped claim on the productivity of its citizens, and that claim became the collateral for government debt. The Federal Reserve could now create money and lend it to the government, confident that the government could always tax its citizens to pay it back. In other words, your labor became the backing for the national debt. The income tax and central banking were designed to work together, and they have ever since. So who benefited from this new system? The federal government, first and foremost. Before 1913, it was constrained by tariff revenues and excise taxes. After 1913, it could borrow almost without limit, knowing it could always raise income taxes to cover the debt. Wars could be financed on a scale never before imagined. The New Deal, the Great Society, the military-industrial complex, none of these would have been possible without the income tax. The federal government grew from a limited institution into a bureaucratic colossus. And the wealthy, ironically, often found ways to shelter their income through loopholes, deductions, and preferential treatment for capital gains. The very people the tax was supposed to target became experts at avoiding it. The burden fell, as it always does, on the middle class, those without accountants, lawyers, and offshore trusts. Today, the income tax generates over $2 trillion annually for the federal government. The Form 1040 requires over 100 pages of instructions. The tax code itself runs to thousands of pages, and yet somehow, no matter how much revenue is collected, the government spends more. The national debt exceeds $30 trillion. The promise of 1913 that a small, targeted tax on the wealthy would solve the problem of unfair tariffs has become perhaps the most consequential lie in American financial history. The lesson here is not that all taxes are evil. It is that temporary government programs rarely remain temporary. It is that mechanisms of extraction, once created, expand far beyond their original purpose. It is that promises made by politicians in one generation are broken by the next. And it is that most people will never see the trap until they are already inside it. In 1913, conservatives thought they had outsmarted the progressives by forcing a constitutional amendment. They lost. Progressives thought they had created a weapon against the rich. They lost too. The only winners were those who understood that once government gains a power, it never gives it back. The income tax that was supposed to be temporary became permanent. The rates that were supposed to stay low went as high as 94%. The tax that was supposed to affect only the wealthy now reaches into the pocket of every working American. So the next time someone promises that a new tax or program will only affect the rich, only be temporary, only require a small sacrifice, remember 1913. Remember that the pattern has repeated for over a century. Remember that governments do not shrink their own power voluntarily. And remember that your financial freedom depends on understanding history, not believing promises. Because if you don't understand how the system extracts wealth, you will always be the one paying the bill. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Its financial system and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.